Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I will try to add to what has already been brilliantly discussed for about an hour now, specifically regarding these agents of transformation and the underlying changes they bring. First, a few figures. This is a study that was conducted by by Google and our colleagues at BCG, focusing in particular on the current adoption of AI in businesses, and more specifically on how AI is now being integrated into business processes. The figures are quite interesting because in reality, what you see is that there are actually 4 categories into which the different companies are grouped. We have those we call the essentials, meaning those that have started to explore AI, but still remain very manual and have only tested the technologies. Then there are those making up 43% in the scaling category that are running several AI projects but haven't really managed to orchestrate all these initiatives on a global scale. Next, we have the 19% we call the leaders, who have truly optimized their existing operations to the fullest with AI, but who are still, as of now, in an optimized state. And then there are those who have truly succeeded in transformation, and they make up less than 1%. This is really a figure that shows just how much room for improvement there still is today. All this, why? Because today there are a lot of tools. I think that if you follow the news, you see the number of new technologies, startups, and models coming out every day. Just keeping up with the news is a full-time job. And so this really shows just how complicated it is today to move from a tool-based approach to a process-based approach. And that's why today we have these figures that reflect the complexity of the market. I also wanted to share a second interesting figure with you, which is that today about 2/3 of company data is not used. That means 2/3 of all your data today is not being used or not being used at all. And this, in a way, reflects 3 very significant obstacles that, once again, prevent companies today from truly taking hold of these technologies. The first obstacle is data itself, as I just mentioned. It's really about being able to make use of this data. Then, of course, there are organizational silos. It's true that now marketing is not such a young profession, and today it inherits a lot of rigidities from the past. Rigidities in terms of channels, rigidities in terms of company organization, which means that even now it's not necessarily easy to have something that is truly orchestrated. And finally, a last aspect that is also very important is integration, because it's very easy to do something let's say like in a silo that isn't integrated with exports each time. But truly integrating technology into the company, both upstream and downstream of the processes, is much more complex. So I suggest we spend a bit of time together to look at all of this. An interesting point, and the reason why we're spending this afternoon together, is precisely because we've reached a point in technology where we can solve these challenges. We can do it. Why? Because for more than 2 years now, almost 2.5 years, with LLMs and generative AI models, we've had the ability to process very large volumes of data. It has been a pretty impressive paradigm shift. You've all worked on or heard about use cases involving RAG to query knowledge bases. I'm going to give you some examples that are more unusual, but just as interesting. For example, there are companies today that collect various Google Analytics logs and are able, from those logs, not just to look at what a person did, but to understand the person's intent while they're on your site. Let me give you an example. I'll build on what Justin mentioned earlier, which was really interesting. Imagine that you run a fashion site or an interior design site, and you have a customer browsing tables, chairs, a sofa, and a coffee table. And actually, in an ideal world, if your site is reasonably well designed, you'll retarget them with all the products they've viewed. The poor guy or girl will end up bombarded with ads for products that, in the end, they don't even want to buy. Whereas in reality, with Zuma, if you look at the big picture, this person is actually redecorating their living room. That's the real situation. They're looking for a bunch of products that go together, trying to redecorate their space a bit. And if, instead of just knowing that they're interested in a sofa or a coffee table, you realize that they're actually redecorating their living room, that's much more valuable for you and could lead to much more targeted marketing actions. So this is also where LEMS can take a critical look, analyze large volumes of data, and be able to generate interesting actions and insights. We've also seen this in many other use cases. We do a lot of synthesis on this data. In short, there are a lot of them. And so today now, for the past 6 months, we've been hearing about it every morning, almost on BFM TV, but we hear a lot about the word agent. And the agent is precisely This second wave, it means that now we're able to process data very efficiently. With the agent, we're able to activate it, to orchestrate it. And this is an important revolution because it allows us to address lack of orchestration, harmonization between different channels we had before. So what I suggest now, I thought a lot when I was preparing this presentation. How am I going to approach the topic? Should I overwhelm you with lots of technical details, talk to you about platforms? Personally, I would have loved that, but I don't think most of you would. So I told myself I'll try to give you a few key focus points each time, still with a bit of a technological angle, to show you how today we can really approach this topic and how we can make it our own. So the first point is data. As we've said, it's very important. I'm deliberately not talking about my slides. I'm just giving you a few examples so you can take a look. But the goal is really to think beyond the slide. As I said, the LLM is truly a perfect tool for processing data. You need to understand that data is the raw material for everything you can do with generative AI, because if you don't have high quality data, as you already know, you can't do much in terms of integration. So what's really important is to be able to fully leverage your data. This can be done in two ways. First, it can be done in a curative mode on your existing data. How can I use LLMs to improve data quality? So here's an example for a retailer where, in fact, often in product listings, when you have, for example, a marketplace, you have a lot of products being added which are poorly filled out, where the fields aren't necessarily well organized. Or maybe you use Google Shopping and you send feeds to Google. And often, well, part of the feeds don't go through because the data isn't of good quality. So today with LLMs, we're able to correct these feeds, fix this data, and as a result, improve the product listings, also enhance the visuals of the underlying products, and therefore make the products and feeds more appealing. That's the corrective approach. Proactively, not just correctively. It's about how we transform every piece of data entering your ecosystem into qualified, high quality data. Let me give you an example. Today, a customer calls your call center. Well, that call shouldn't just result in the agent taking notes, writing down 90% of it. In their own words, somewhere where there's a 50-50 chance it won't even end up in the CRM in the end. In fact, this means that out of 100% of calls, when it comes to quality, you're going to lose 2/3 between the note-taking, the quality of those notes, and your ability to retrieve them. Every interaction with a customer needs to be captured from the very beginning, processed, used, leveraged, and should enrich your CRM. You really need to make sure that everything coming into your system is properly organized. This is the number one key to ensuring that you have very high quality raw material to be able to leverage this data with agentic AI. The second point I wanted to share with you is integration. As I mentioned earlier, I'll use the call center example again because I just finished talking about it. When you have a call center, imagine that tomorrow you want, for example, to equip your agents in the call center with tools that help them better answer customer questions. So today, agents often have a search bar where they type in the customer's question, and then 3 or 4 PDFs will pop up. They'll say, please hold, don't hang up. They'll look things up a bit. They'll try to answer the question. They'll go, I'm going to put you on hold for a moment. I'll ask my manager. In short, see, I think that as a business and as a consumer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, the dream, the holy grail for everyone is to ask, can't I use generative AI so that advisors can just type into the search bar and have the generative AI answer them right away? That's fantastic, but once again, there's a catch. Why? Because while the person is typing, they are less focused on the conversation, and potentially, sometimes, they type the question incorrectly. There's a delay, the network isn't good, and so on. Ideally, what we would need is for an AI to listen to the call at the same time as the advisor during a call, and for that AI to actually ask the question to another AI, which would then find the answer and display it to the advisor. So the advisor is completely focused on the conversation, doesn't have to worry about anything, their hands are free. And the AI pushes relevant information to them in real time to help with the response. Well, to do that, obviously, you first need to have the entire telephony system connected to your AI. And on the other end, your AI also needs to be connected to your knowledge bases and your CRM to have the customer context. In short, integration needs to be done for it to work. And often, unfortunately, back then, today, with AI, as we've seen this, it's very easy. It takes 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks. But putting it into production immediately becomes a nightmare because, all right, we don't have a connector. We're on an old version of the telephony system. We're waiting to switch to the new version in 2027. In short, the reality today is that it's very complicated. So you absolutely have to anticipate these points of friction because without that, you'll never manage to scale up. The third point, and perhaps the most technical, is also the question of trust. Why trust? Because today, you have surely seen or explored all these agent-based technologies. And the reality is that I'm going to project you into a future that's not so far off. But with all the technologies you have, with what we call co-pilots, so all these AIs that help you in your daily life, that you can easily create with just a few clicks by saying, here, I upload some PDFs, I give you access to this knowledge, etc., and you're going to help me every day. Well, today, for every human employee, there are potentially 3 or 4 AI agents assisting them on a daily basis. So imagine that in reality, your workforce tomorrow is actually 1,000 people plus 4,000 AIs. Well, I think that if tomorrow your company went from 1,000 people to 4,000 people, you would definitely resize your HR department accordingly. You would naturally say to yourself, well, it's not the same thing to manage 4,000 people as it is to manage 1,000. But when it comes to AI, no one is asking that question. No one seems bothered by the idea that there are 4,000 AIs out there with access to data, which are potentially duplicated everywhere, which cost money because you pay per request, and which in the end are actually uncontrolled and uncontrollable. That really raises serious questions about, well, just how viable this is today from an economic standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, from a security standpoint, and from a compliance standpoint. So it really raises important questions. Another interesting aspect is to consider that, of course, there are these everyday AI co-pilots. But there's also this ambition for the future to say, I'm going to redefine my processes with AI. I'm going to deploy agents everywhere to automate things. Of course, I'll keep some control, but I'm going to automate those tasks. Well, in a way, if tomorrow you do that and you delegate anti-company processes, key processes, to AI, but you have no oversight of what's happening, then you really need to question what our role as humans is in all of this. But beyond that, it means that in some way we've lost control over processes that are very important for the company. All of this raises real questions about how today we're able to benefit from these technologies, to take advantage of them, but at the same time do so with increased control and confidence that everything will go smoothly. So there are 4 important factors. There are others, of course. I didn't want to make a laundry list with 500 factors, but the important points are to ask, is it economically viable? You know that these are models where you pay per request. So there are lots of different models. Some are small, some are large. There are competitors. Some are very expensive and some are not very expensive. But in reality, you always pay each time. That's why you really need to consider the economic equation of what you're implementing. Reliability, I'm not telling you anything new. These models tend to hallucinate. What recent studies have also shown is that even worse, the more powerful they are, the more likely they are to hallucinate. So if you take the latest reasoning models, they hallucinate more than the models that don't reason. Why is that? Because when they reason, they become more subjective. When they are more subjective, they are more likely to start saying nonsense. So that's also why a more powerful model doesn't necessarily mean a more reliable one. You have to be careful about that. There are also security issues because if you connect these models to your company data, to your APIs, someone with bad intentions could potentially take advantage of that. Putting a door on your house obviously allows you to enter your home, but it also allows a thief to get in. So if your door isn't secure, then anyone can get in as well. And you have to be aware of these aspects because it's very important, and poor architectural design choices can have dramatic consequences for security issues. And finally, compliance. The most basic but also the most telling example I can give you is that you wouldn't want, if you put a chatbot on your website tomorrow, for it to log your competitors' data. Even if it might be deserved, you still wouldn't want that. That's why you need to be very clear about what you want your chatbots to say, and how you want your AIs to respond. That's why to achieve this, what we often set up are what we call, now I won't go into the technical details of all this, but just to give you a few conceptual elements, what we call agentic platforms. So today we are hosted by Google, and we want to thank them for this, for their hospitality and for organizing this event. And Google in particular offers a platform called Audience Space, which allows you to manage your AIs, build your AIs and supervise them. And an important point in this platform approach, Andy, as Justine mentioned earlier, and I completely agree with her, also echoes something Jensen, the CEO of India, said. Tomorrow, you'll see the IT department will become the HR department for agents. Now, that's not entirely false, but it's not entirely true either. It's not entirely false because, well, in a way, when we think of agents, we think of technology. And when we think of technology, we think of IT. So maybe that's a bit of a bias. We might have jumped to conclusions a bit too quickly, but in reality, yes, the IT department will obviously be affected by this. But it's a bit like in companies. Today, HR management of employees isn't handled solely by the HR department. It's handled by their direct supervisor, their direct manager, by their peers. In fact, the HR department is everyone. HR in a company isn't just the HR department. And it's the same for agents. When you implement an application, a chatbot on your website, obviously there are IT aspects to the chatbot. The chatbot's latency, does it respond quickly enough? Does it work quite simply? Does the application work? But there are also other aspects that aren't dependent on IT. It will tell you, well, the chatbot works on the website. When I ask a question, it answers. But just because it answers doesn't mean the answer is relevant. And just because the answer is relevant doesn't mean the answer is correct. And that's where we see there's a difference between the application maintenance of a generative AI technology and the application maintenance of a traditional software engineering technology. And that's why it's obviously important to recognize that data teams have a role to play in evaluating these AIs to determine whether they're responding correctly. And business teams also need to ask, beyond just the answer, is it actually correct? And is it also relevant for the user? And that's why I think it's important to consider things not only from a platform perspective, but also from an organizational and governance standpoint, so that we can effectively manage, control, and make these technologies available in the future. One last aspect is the user experience, which is very important. I won't steal Francois's thunder, as he'll be presenting this with me later when we discuss the Bouygues Telecom case. But it's also really important to remember that the trap we must avoid is trying to optimize today's world with agents instead of simply redefining the world of tomorrow. Because the goal of agents isn't just to think about how to do what we have today better, or to try to supercharge the agent onto the current process, but rather to consider how to completely redefine the process. And it's the same for the user experience. We must not forget that you will benefit from this technology, but your consumers already benefit from it through technologies like Gemini, ChatGPT, and others. So they have been immersed in it for 2 years now. So thinking to yourself, I'll implement generative AI to optimize post-start my operations, misses the fact that consumers also have very high expectations. We need to think about the world of tomorrow. From a UX design and integration perspective, it means how do I reintegrate these technologies and redefine customer journeys. Finally, as Justine mentioned earlier, there's the aspect of transformation. We need to be aware that we're not just doing a proof of concept. We're not just making minor improvements to a business process. We are truly impacting professions, redefining the role of IT within the company, redefining the role of data, and transforming the processes and the business itself. And so inevitably, this requires sponsorship. You can't do this alone. That means if you try to do this on your own, the risk is that in the end, you've optimized something locally, but you haven't truly transformed the company as a whole. That's why the advice I always give to everyone is that you really need to aim very, very high. And it's not just, I'm not only talking about budget issues, of course it involves budgets, but it's also about transformation, because ultimately you're going to impact people's daily work. And when you affect people's daily routines, it requires training, it requires education, it requires cultural adaptation, and it also involves a lot of aspects that sometimes aren't within our scope, and that require very high level sponsorship to really make it work properly. Finally, one last point, and the last warning I wanted to give you is that we conducted a study at the beginning of 2025, which was presented by the Minister of Labour, in which we saw just how big the gap is between employees' expectations and the reality on the ground. Today, 51% of people say they lack training in AI, and almost half of employees have never received any training related to AI. And in a world where we promise to transform every company's processes with AI, well, I find that this is actually quite an alarming observation, and it shows just how unprepared we still are today to truly ride this wave of agentic technology. So the important point is to realize that we shouldn't just think of it purely as, yes, it's a technology. It's not just a technological issue. Of course, there are technological challenges, but it's not just a technological issue. First and foremost, it's really an organizational challenge, a matter of implementation, d'examda, and of redefining the company's role.